high level. It is on computer vision and bridging the gap between research and applied robotics. So I don't think you are here to listen to me talk about Dr. Saurav Garg's research. You are here to listen to him, sir. So, sir, please, you can start. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Pratham. Thanks for this introduction. So I'll start sharing my screen. Can you see the screen, the slides?
Yes, sir. It is visible.
Yes, sir. It's visible.
All right, great. So thanks for the introduction. And yes, as Pratham mentioned, so that particular paper, that is one of my favorite ones. And in general, I do research in computer vision, robotic vision, and combine machine learning, and mainly motivated with the applications of robotics. So today's talk is about computer vision and bridging the gap between research and applied robotics. My name is Saurav Garg. I'm a research fellow at Queensland University of Technology, and there I'm leading as a research fellow the perception and localization theme. So robots around us. So there are several applications and several different examples where we have seen in different forms how robots have been around us. So for example, in this case, this is iRobots, one of the domestic cleaning robots. And we can see that how starting from just normal vacuum cleaning, they have now come up to a point that it can actually do mopping and a few different mapping, using a few different mapping techniques to do its job much better. Then there are these social robots where the task is to interact with humans. And if you notice this particular Pepper robot, you'll see how it does its gestures, how it makes eye contact, and it tries to interact with the person in a way so that it feels seamless as if you were talking to a human. And then one of the most hyped technologies of today's world, autonomous driving. It has applications in transport, logistics, and just in general, carrying humans from one place to another. And you'll see in this example from Waymo that how this car is trying to understand its environment using several different sensors. And this is one of the hardest tasks of, I would say, in terms of autonomy, where you have to get a really good understanding of your surroundings and then take decisions so that you can actually operate safely. And one of the main reasons for having autonomous driving is to reduce accidents. So it is meant for safety. And then it is up to the car manufacturers and the researchers behind this whole industry who make sure that the right algorithms are being developed to make this happen. And then finally, multi-purpose robots. So this one in particular, Spot from Boston Dynamics, this one is so good at traversing different terrains. And it can do that on a variety of different terrains. Although the most popular videos for this one is of its dancing, which I always enjoy. But it's again a big feat in terms of both hardware and software technologies, the way this particular robot has come to the point. And not just in terms of navigation, but also in terms of manipulating and performing different high-level functions. So another word for robotics, especially in terms of autonomy, is embodied AI. So autonomous cars is one of those examples, but also other technologies, for example, augmented reality and virtual reality. So that is again one of the, these are again other applications where the underlying research is quite the same, or they share a lot in terms of how we localize, how we understand the environment around us, and then use machine learning, computer vision, and similar tools to then actually perform that task more intelligently. So embodied AI is one of the ways of thinking about how something which is intelligent and is actually moving as an embodied agent. So there are, I think, 3 different building blocks for having a particular robotic application. And these would be, in most cases, very common to any kind of higher level functioning robot. So the first one is perception. And in this particular example, you can see, and this is an example of a robot as an autonomous driving car. You can see that there are different dynamic objects like pedestrians and cars. And this is not an easy task to actually detect each of these objects precisely and then be able to track them so that the robot can take the right decision in terms of how it navigates this environment. And then there are other things, for example, traffic lights, traffic signs, road signs, lane markings, buildings. So all of that forms the static infrastructure of the environment. And that is something which is relatively still easier to understand because that is the part of your map that remains static. And the most difficult part is to be able to deal with these dynamic objects and make sure that always the robot is constantly understanding them in a way that it can actually safely plan its journey. And the related task is localization. Where am I? And for all these examples from different movies, the question here the protagonist is asking is, where am I? And just imagine when a robot actually wakes up and then it has, obviously, we're not talking about consciousness as such, but when it wakes up, then it has to know where it is so that it can localize itself and then navigate and then perform other tasks. So this becomes one of the most fundamental abilities to be able to localize by looking around and checking in terms by recognizing where it is and then doing some other functions. And with that localization capability, the main thing which it would want to do is navigate so that, and this is I'm talking about in terms of mobile robots. And in terms of navigation, one of the most common keywords you might have heard of is SLAM, visual SLAM in particular, where we talk about simultaneous localization and mapping. But this particular example is the one where there's another type of navigation system, which is teach and repeat. And I deliberately took this example where you first take the robot through a particular environment, and this environment can be highly unstructured. And once you teach the robot that path, it can next time repeat that path by using a particular algorithm in terms of which we'll look at this video. But this is different from how some of these robots would operate in structured environments. And this one does so in unstructured environments just by having an initial teach run of that particular environment. So here you can see that it is doing a few different tasks. It is doing visual odometry. It is doing tracking of its experiences based on what it had seen in the past. But then still on the spot, it is able to make decisions about how its environment looks like and have, for example, here an understanding of what the terrain is so that it can traverse on that. So third building block I consider is interaction. And as you go from perception to navigation to interaction, these tasks become more and more difficult. And so this particular task, when we talk about interaction, this one, it has to solve the problems of perception and localization and navigation so that it can then go on to this high level functioning of interacting and then solving some other tasks which we would want them to be doing. As for example, in this case, this is a robot assistant Leo from one of the robotics companies. And here we can see as it interacts, it has to do some sort of perception task. Here it is trying to detect, recognize faces and detecting temperature with a few different sensors mounted on it. And then it is performing manipulation tasks as well. So for example, opening the door in this case. And as we'll see further, a few more examples, for example, object detection, that is a classical computer vision task, grasping, a particular robotics task. And then again, some computer vision task, for example, face detection recognition, and then doing some sort of high level tasks, for example, transporting water, food, or doing other kind of things. So to have such robots where you can actually do these kinds of functions, you'll first need to solve all these basic fundamental problems and then get onto this point. So what goes behind the scenes in terms of research? So I have marked down a few things here. So computer vision and machine learning, these are one of the main tools which are definitely required to be able to solve these problems. And they are all of these rectangular blocks. They're all in their own right. They're big research areas. And computer vision and machine learning here, I've marked them in terms of perception. And then it comes to control and planning, which is particularly about robots, whereas computer vision and machine learning could be applied to different areas. And control and planning, this is also this is something which is probably growing more at this stage, simply because the other two, computer vision and machine learning, they have matured to a point that we can now use these technologies to do bigger tasks. And then again, the fourth one, social interaction, which is at this stage is not going at that pace, but as we solve other tasks which lead to this particular bigger task, we'll get there. And to enable all of these compute and sensors in terms of different hardware technologies, that has always been one of the main things to make sure that other software technologies are actually moving fast. So one great example of this is GPUs, so graphical processing units. These were not the moment we started using those, and then with the help of deep learning, which was like neural networks were there before, but with help of these computing devices, we were able to push computer vision to the point that we can actually solve many tasks much better as we were able to do in the classical settings. So why computer vision? So cameras, we know they're cheap, they are ubiquitous, they require low power, and they're information rich. But most importantly, they operate in the same way as we humans do. So as the human vision system, how the way it works, it passes an image through its eyes, you process that image in your brain, and then we can make out of that information whatever we are seeing, that what it is. So for example, in this case, these are fruits. And the same thing happens with the computer vision system. So there are images which are being passed by some of the sensing devices, for example, cameras. And then there are big processing units, GPUs and CPUs, which are processing this information the way human brain works, and especially with the analogy of having neural networks in place there. And then we are able to make that information out, like what is it that we are seeing, and we understand that. So the fact that there are these analogies, it also is a sign of intelligence in there, and that is why we call all of this as artificial intelligence, embodied AI, or spatial AI, where we try to mimic how the way humans understand their environment and then operate. Same thing is what we want from robots to be doing. So what are the requirements for robotics? Like we know we have these tools with us, but what is it we want as characteristics for most of our robots? So one of the most important things is interpretability. So as we think of tasks which are high level and we want robots to be doing that, so in order to understand what they're actually doing, so we don't want black box systems. We want these technologies to be much more interpretable. Then interaction. So robots would be operating in and around us. And we have to have not just interaction with humans, but robot interaction, robots interacting with the things, objects around them, and then also interacting with humans. Performance, we want them to be precisely doing their tasks without faltering, because safety is often one of the most important things when we have robots operating around us, and they need to be performing really well and be able to solve their tasks with the most accurate way, in the most accurate way. Then efficiency. So in most cases, robots typically are resource constrained. So having low compute time, low latency, low storage, low memory footprint, and then requiring low power. So these are a lot of constraints to be put on robots. And this is something which we know as a practical bottleneck, and then we have to solve these problems. And it comes down to both hardware and software technologies to be able to provide this kind of a system which can actually operate with all these constraints satisfied. And then be able to leverage modern hardware and software. So that is again, that comes down to having those algorithms in place which can make use of different sensor technologies, different hardware technologies, and obviously the software. So bridging the gap, this was one of the, this is part of the title of this talk. So we know there are these research tools, we know what robotic applications are there and what kind of characteristics we want for these robots to be able to be deployed in practical scenarios. So I've marked here 6 different subtopics, which I think are some of the bottlenecks which current research efforts are being directed to, so that we can then make sure that in due time we have fewer problems to solve and more robots around us operating in a better manner. So first of all, efficient systems. So with efficient systems, I mean both hardware and software technologies, making it a deployable system, not just something which works on one big machine or requires a lot of cloud compute. Then challenging conditions. So most often what happens, like there are these settings where robots would work in ideal conditions, for example, daytime, but what happens when you operate when you operate under nighttime conditions or under snowy conditions. Then sensor fusion. In most cases, robots they have multiple sensors on board, and there are these technologies which are to be designed so that you can take data from different sensors, and then be able to make a decision by fusing information from all of them. Then the spatiotemporal nature. This is something which is not leveraged to the point as we would want. So the fact that robots operate in an environment, and this is a spatial environment where you have information, not just about your surroundings, your ego motion, but also the fact that you are operating in a continuous manner. So there's the spatiotemporal nature of the problem. Benchmarking, I think, is another important thing. So it is important to identify research problems, formalize them, and then benchmark them, evaluate them in a way that it is closer to how the robots will be operating in real time. Then finally, semantic reasoning. So this is quite important because we want not just to have low-level information being leveraged for solving tasks, but also think the way humans think of their environment. So when we look at something, we think of them in terms of objects and high-level concepts. So that is what we also want with robots to be happening. And I'll cover these 6 subtopics now until the end of this talk. So efficient systems, like I said, there are these hardware-based systems, for example, computational efficiency. So use of GPUs is one of the main bits here, which has pushed this computer vision research and machine learning research to the point that it is much more useful in robotics now. Then the power source. This is quite important with electric cars, like just having that kind of wattage so that you can put these different compute resources on and then be able to take decisions in as much low latency as possible. And then also new sensors, for example, neuromorphic sensors, for example, event cameras here. And you can see at the top right here that these cameras can reconstruct images in a much better way as compared to standard cameras. And event cameras also, they process information at a very high rate, which means that there are many problems which can be solved through these specific devices as compared to standard cameras. And many of these techniques, many of these sensors would use techniques which have been developed in computer vision. So it is kind of a win-win situation. And in terms of software, when it comes to how do we utilize these hardware sensors or these compute devices, there are also different ways of making your system much more efficient. For example, standard techniques from other literature, like principal component analysis, or even techniques like quantization and binarization. These are very common in robotics, and we often use them to make sure that whatever we are designing, that is close to real time. And then it comes to other techniques, for example, how we design a system. Here, this is an example of hierarchical method for doing localization. And here, this hierarchical system brings in the efficiency part because you can have high performance, but at the same time, you can reduce the storage footprint and compute time. And it's a win-win-win. This particular work was done by Nikhil Verma Keetha. He's from ISM. And that is where this fest is also being organized. And he did this work with us as an intern at QUT with I and Michael Milford. And this work was published in Robotics and Automation Letters this year. And RAL, according to Google Scholar Metrics, is right now the topmost robotics journal. The second component after the second subtopic after efficiency is challenging environmental conditions. So you can see there are 4 images here, which have been taken from the same place. And you can see that under different day and night conditions or different season conditions, the appearance of the scene changes drastically. And this makes this task much more harder because it is so hard to recognize the same place. And like even humans can fail at this task. So it is much more difficult for robots as well. So what happens is when we have these kinds of scenarios, for example, nighttime, so the common scene understanding tasks, for example, semantic segmentation, they would often fail quite a lot. For example, in this case, we can see that most of the area which should be marked as sky, it is marked as vegetation in the bottom example, and it is marked as building in the top example. So building here is being depicted as gray, and vegetation is being depicted as green. So this is one of these are some challenges which are still open research problems where we want to have systems which can operate under challenging environmental conditions. Another example is monocular depth estimation, which is often one of the problems which we can solve with other sensors. But the fact that the way humans understand their environment, they don't need stereo vision or depth sensors. So we can estimate, we can get the idea of how things are far or close to us just by looking at them through our vision. And that is why monocular depth estimation is a big research area. And we can see that when it comes to nighttime conditions, it fails catastrophically. So what we've done about it is mainly we've come up with new algorithms, for example, making use of deep learning. And this is one example where generative adversarial networks are being used for converting nighttime images to daytime. Although the quality of conversion is not always good, and it can be very much specific to a particular environment. But here, this particular paper shows that it is quite possible to still convert the images in somewhat a sensible manner, and then be able to match features so that we can recognize that place and be able to localize. But it's not just about deep learning based systems. We have also seen more research emerging where we can see that if we use zero-shot systems, which are based on physics-based priors, where different reflection models are used so that one can then estimate how, for example, edge information, which is most often preserved across these different appearance conditions, it can be utilized to still make sense of what we are looking at. So these classical techniques are still valid, and they combine very well with deep learning based systems. The third topic here is sensor fusion. So as you can see here, this is one particular example of driver assistance systems. And all these sensors which are there on modern cars, they're also there, or even more of these sensors are there on autonomous cars. And there are all these sensors are meant to be there for solving different tasks. But either they are specialized for that particular task, or they could be used in conjunction so that the car can make much better decisions because it has access to a lot of different kind of information. And for example, here we have radar, LiDAR, camera, and GPS and IMU sensors are quite common anyway. So having all of the access to all of these sensors and be able to utilize this information, fuse this information to make better decisions, it is still an open research problem. And one particular example here is the use of image sequences, which I think is something which one can use as an implicit source of information to construct point clouds. But anyway, point cloud information is still available through LiDAR-like sensors. And having these kinds of different modalities, one can use them to then create, then learn to fuse this information so that they can perform different tasks. here in this example, in this particular paper from RAL 2020, it is shown that once you use these two different modalities, you can combine them together to create a single representation of a particular place. And then that representation can be used for recognizing and localizing. The fourth bit here is spatiotemporal nature of the data or the task. So as you can see, changing environmental conditions in this particular video, and then the car is traversing through the environment as it moves. It understands its environment, and there is this spatiotemporal nature of this data which can be leveraged. And we haven't seen, there are these methods which do SLAM, which is more explicit. There are other implicit techniques which learn these representations inherently, but there is still a lot more that can be done to leverage this spatiotemporal information in a much better way. There are these methods, which some of those have been developed in our lab, and then some of those in other labs around the world, and then all of these different methods, they try to learn a representation or devise a representation of the environment, which is more of a sequential descriptor and solves the task of recognition as a video retrieval problem as compared to image retrieval, which is much more common in localization. Here's another example, and I'll first, before I run this video, I'll explain what each of these things mean here. So as I mentioned that before, that PCA as a dimension reduction technique is quite common in robotics. And here in this example, the green and orange curves which you see here, the green represents the autumn traverse, the orange represents the summer traverse, but these curves here, they do not represent the GPS coordinates. They represent the latent embedding, which is embedded in 3D space. So this is the latent appearance space. And when I play this video, you'll see that the green and orange curves will move as the vehicle moves through the environment in two different conditions, but the places are corresponding to each other. So we'll expect the green and orange curves to align with each other very well. So as you can see, in most cases, there is this little bit of offset in how these embeddings are moving, but in most cases, the shape of these embeddings remain the same, which shows that at any given place, regardless of what appearance conditions are there, these 3D embeddings, they tend to be quite similar, at least in their shapes. The fifth thing which we have here is benchmarking and evaluation. So this is quite important, because if we do not formulate the research problem well, and if we do not benchmark them or evaluate them in the way how we're going to use them in the final deployment scenario, then there is always going to be a gap in what we do in research and what is then done in the application side. So VPR Bench, this is one of our recent works where we, in collaboration with other universities, where we did a big benchmark of visual place recognition. And this is one of the core components of localization. Here we came up with different techniques and different data sets, along with different evaluation metrics. And all of them, when put together, we had a lot of insights into this particular problem and realized that, okay, this is what is still pending as an open research problem. And then there are other things which still, which can be considered probably close to be solved. And it also gives us some insights into what are the right evaluation metrics to be used. Another similar example is 6ToF localization, where in this particular benchmark from another group, they have, again, heaps of data sets, a few particular metrics, which are used for evaluating 6ToF visual localization, and having this particular benchmark, and then having a submission option so that you can run these data sets with your methods and then participate in some sort of a challenge. That is something which this group runs every year in different conferences. And it has seen it has actually pushed the research quite a bit. And this is one of the things which often it is done in research, that you create benchmarks and challenges so that people participate in them. And then that is one way of pushing the research much faster than any other possible way. again, this is one work where we revisited the visual place recognition problem and looked at all the different aspects of that research problem. So what happens is when we are trying to benchmark or evaluate it, before that, we have to actually understand what are the different aspects of that problem. And this is what we did in this particular paper this year, which was published in HCAI. And you can see that visual place recognition as the central block here, referred to as VPR in blue. It has different connections to different things. So first of all, at the top, it is connected to the definition of visual place recognition. And we realized that there was no real consensus of how you would define this. How would you define a place, or how would you define the task of place recognition and place matching? And there are different bio-inspired definitions of the same. One which says that you can look at it as place cells which are found in mammalian brain, or it could also be thought of as spatial view cells which rely on visual overlap. Similarly, on the left-hand side, you can see environment, agent, and task. This is something which then governs how place recognition or localization algorithms should be developed. So that can be dependent on what kind of environment you're operating in, outdoor versus indoor, for example, what kind of robotic agent it is, whether it is a drone, it is something underwater or on ground, then what kind of task, the ultimate task it is doing, which links back to the purple colored block, which says whether you're doing global relocalization, whether you're doing SLAM or structure from motion. So different downstream tasks, which are still research tasks, they may have different requirements of this particular visual place recognition subtask. And then finally, depending on the final application, whether it is autonomous driving, navigation, virtual reality, augmented reality, so it would again govern what kind of algorithms you would use and how would you go about evaluating them and doing research about it. And that is why the bottom right block here with metrics and data sets, that becomes important then, because it tells us what kind of metrics we should be using. And then the red block at the bottom left is different related areas with visual place recognition. And so when we touch on the different related problems with this particular problem of visual place recognition, which is one of my PhD areas of research, so we realized that, okay, there are these different problems being solved in other areas of research, and what we can learn from those solutions, or the way those problems are formulated, or how those can benefit from what we are doing in our research. So it is kind of tying all of this together and understanding the problem better, so that we can then solve it in a way that it is close to a deployable solution. And the final bit here is semantic reasoning. So there is always the work which is done in computer vision research, which typically looks at processing the pixel information and then arriving at some sort of decision, which would be either generating representations of that image, or it could be object detection or some other tasks. But the kind of representation we start with, that could change the way we process that information. For example, here it is the system from 2010, it uses Stixels, which is different from, and this uses domain assumption. We are assuming that this is the kind of environment we're going to operate in. And then what is it that we can do differently? So we can probably, instead of considering everything as a pixel level or a patch level thing, we could consider something as vertical blocks. And this kind of high level representation is important. And a more common one is where we use semantic blobs. So we parse an image and then understand, okay, what are the different blobs here? One is tree, one is it could be road, buildings, sky. So once we have those segments, then we can either select as with the domain assumptions, what is it that is going to be relevant, or we could extract that information by learning, by performing the task, by learning to do the task end to end. So for example, in this paper, which we did recently, which does a kind of bridging of semantics, as we look at what machine tries to learn, how machine thinks what is it as an object. For example, it could merge different buildings together, or it could split a building into different parts. So what kind of semantic or what kind of meaning it extracts from these patches, that could vary how we as humans look at things and how machine looks at things. So that bridging of semantics for humans and machines is again one of the important or interesting things, which would also bridge the gap between research and final deployment of these solutions. And then mapping is one very important part of most of the robotic applications, because whenever robots operate, they operate in a particular environment quite often repeatedly. So it is important to have a good representation of that map. And here, this is an example of a detailed semantic map, which is a hierarchical map. It has multiple layers, which defines objects, places, rooms, and at different levels of hierarchies, it has different representations. And this is quite important because it also has semantic layers. So it would eventually enable interaction options, but it also has all these different levels of hierarchies, which actually help you reason at all those different levels separately. And then 3D reconstruction, view synthesis. This is something which humans inherently do very well. We are able to interpolate between information quite seamlessly. But it's only just recently that there are these methods which have now come out. For example, this one is neural radiance fields, NeRFs-based system, where looking at just few images, we can then do an implicit 3D reconstruction of that whole scene. And this is going to be a kind of a major milestone in this research for robotics, where if we are able to use this kind of these kinds of algorithms in a more contractible manner, then this should really help us develop better solutions. So finally, where does this all bring us to? So there is this term spatial AI, which has been coined by one of the leading researchers in robotics. And what it means is probably tries to bring in, from the software side, at least, computer vision, machine learning, and robotics together. So it talks about having those embodied agents and having that kind of intelligence of the spatial environment where they're operating. And all these different tools or all these different research areas are necessary to then have that level of spatial AI, which is what probably would be, what we want, but we don't know when that'll happen. So that is what I thought was what were the different things which were the gaps in having the computer vision, machine learning, and robotics research, and then going to the robotics applications. And I'm happy to take questions, and I would love to connect with all of you on LinkedIn or Twitter, and you can check out some of the open source repositories we have for different works we did for localization. Thank you. I can take questions now.
Yeah, sure.
Sir,
Yeah, Jeremy can go ahead.
sir, is that possible in future where we can achieve the human level visionary system in robotics?
So I think depending on what kind of task we're doing, we do have many systems where robots or just computer vision performs much better than humans. And this is also changing in especially some of the most impactful areas, for example, medical robotics or just medical imaging. So earlier there was this assumption that it might be hard to have computer vision systems to be able to process any kind of MRI scans, etc., at the level of doctors' expertise, but that is changing quite fast now. But there are some other tasks where robots are too bad. For example, whenever I show those nighttime images or snow images examples, so that is something which robots would still suffer.
Yeah, I had a question like let's about the benchmarking. So like the previous year we had around like more than 40 or 50 papers to say that they can predict COVID and stuff in like chest X-rays. So yeah, like there has to be a certain benchmark that can like set them apart, because after that, after a 6 months gap of those research, so that around 90% of those papers they can't even detect humans I can detect easily. So like there's a problem in benchmarking papers and stuff. So like is there any body or what can be done to like benchmark this so that they can really be applied in like everyday life?
Yeah, so that is what typically happens. Like there is always there are different research groups who try to do different tasks, but then after a while, only maybe one of them, those research groups would try to combine all of that information together and then declare, okay, these methods were devised, but they are not going to be useful, and maybe some of them are still useful. But then comes down to just people who are doing this research. There's no particular body which would try to enforce this kind of benchmarking. It's just that as a researcher, we encourage this kind of attitude that whatever we do, we keep on doing proper benchmarking and evaluation, so that it is sensible and close to being useful, rather than cherry picking data sets or cherry picking metrics and then saying that okay, our method works well, or not telling about the limitations of the proposed method. But this is an issue which we do not have a solution for. But we hope that people do the right thing. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I mean, sure. But like, let's say about in self-driving car also, let's say like we are in an intersection and then like just in front of us, there is a car, but due to certain occlusion, that car is being, is not in my vision for a moment, for the vision of. So like, is there any way to use this like, like just you said that you can use like special AI like that, it can remember what it saw. Like you said that you can remember 5 months ago, like when the seasons were different. But is there any way where you can just remember what happened 5 seconds ago, so that it can be reused right now because of the occlusion? And it can
yeah. So that is one of my favorite areas to dig into. So right now, most of the explicit systems, for example, SLAM or structure from motion, what they do is they explicitly model these things where you would expect, okay, you have been looking at an object, and then if it is occluded, so many of these multi-object tracking systems, they would be able to reason about it that, okay, it could not just disappear just like that. So this object must be somewhere. And having access to 3D information helps that. But I think all of these tasks could be also easily solved a little bit more implicitly. So when I say that we use spatiotemporal information, so if once you have access to a sequence of images, and this could be like information from your past 30 meters of traverse or past 10 seconds or whatever. So that could be then utilized implicitly to then decide, okay, there might be something there which I'm not looking at right now, which is occluded. And it could also be end-to-end task driven. For example, this could be learned in a way that if you are trying to navigate and you have enough data to illustrate that thing, then this kind of behavior could be learned implicitly as well.
Like I'm getting another question. So it's asked that let's say I have I mean about the GPUs and computing stuff. It asks that like if GPUs were originally meant for gaming and graphics stuff. So like if we just found out that they are good at yeah, they are good at neural networks and inference. So but then again a problem raised in raised in around 2018 that yeah, this this doesn't work for mini batches, as in if it gets lesser than, let's say, the particular core value, I mean number of cores, it like it doesn't converges and ends at NaN loss. So like is there any research that goes on for the architecture of the hardware stuff? Because yeah, that's an also issue, because we just found that GPU works for good for neural networks, so we just jumped on GPU. But are there any is there any dedicated architecture to solve these problems?
So I think one of those things which you mentioned that is probably a bit specific because in most cases, in general, GPUs would be still quite efficient in doing this task, especially processing images in a pyramid manner where you look at different multi-scale information from the image. But I think when it comes to looking at something which is very much optimal for the task, then it happens that there are these different specifically designed chips where, for example, if you look at Tesla, so they have their own custom designed chip. And a final solution, any kind of practical solution, would have to do that engineering and that particular research behind that thing, so that they can actually come up with a solution which is very much suited to that particular application. So researchers definitely are looking into these different aspects, but probably not as much as the final solution deploying company or something.
Anyone else has a question right now? Okay, it seems don't have any. Yeah, Hiram, you can unmute yourself.
Good evening, sir. My question was that there's like the recent COVID pandemic, we had like a period where we were able to collect data, and then there was a period where the complete world went into like a state of lockdown, and then we're opening up now slowly again. So in that short period of lockdown, there were a lot of changes that happened in the surrounding environment, and everything, like made for all the lost data and the changes in the surroundings that has happened in like in this time period. Like for example, for self-driving cars, if there's a lot of changes that has happened in the surroundings, I mean.
Yep. So I think those are interesting research problems as well. So we never expected that those things might happen previously. And now we know that, okay, like the particular example which you took here, that there might be changes in the infrastructure, or even in general, maybe fewer dynamic objects to track, or changes in the map of the environment. So now if you were to think of similar things to be happening in future, where there are a lot of changes happening in your infrastructure, or due to pandemic or any other reasons, there are things changing around you, then this becomes an important problem for long-term autonomy. And when I say challenging environmental conditions, so not just changes in day-night conditions, but also structural changes is one of the things which we consider. Like whenever there is any kind of roadworks happening, that is one of those cases where your environment has changed. And at this currently, we don't have a really good solution to deal with these structural changes. So that still remains as an open research problem. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, sir.
Sir, in training, sir, neural networks for image processing, sir, the process takes too much time, sir. But as we humans, sir, we learn image interpretation very quickly. So, is it possible in future that computers can also learn quickly like us?
Yeah, indeed. So there are different types of learning techniques as well. So there are curriculum learning, incremental learning, federated learning techniques, which are different from the most common ones which you'll see in online tutorials, where we just do supervised learning by training for a long time. So I think that all those areas of research which I just mentioned, so in terms of learning in different ways, they are still relatively less mature. But also given the fact that hardware technologies are also getting better and better, so there would definitely be a point that when we can actually have these systems where learning as you go is possible.
Sir, is there any scope for low energy ML architectures like that, TinyML things in computer vision particularly?
Yeah, indeed. So for example, if you might have heard of efficient nets, and also those kinds of networks are typically designed keeping in mind all these resource constrained devices. And then there are also these findings that even if you have a very large architecture, so there are techniques to quantize those network architectures, which would then make it possible that even a bigger architecture can be deployed on a small device with constrained resources. So there is definitely a lot of research going in that direction anyway, which is much more useful for robotics.
Sir, in image interpretation, when we humans learn any image, so we need only some data to learn the image, and we try to extract the features and to relate it to another test images. But sir, in computers, we have to do convolutions after layer. So is it possible that if we teach a computer to interpret image, it can particularly extract the feature and try to relate it with other test images?
I think it does that implicitly in a way, because once you train them, so what you've created is a kind of a memory for that with that network. And it has now learned that, okay, if you get this information again in terms of RGB pixels, then you're kind of matching it with those weight vectors within your neural network, and then deciding, okay, this is where my latent representation is, and this is what I then predict about this particular information which I got. And it is close to what humans also do. So whenever we process information, so the neural networks in our brains, although the architectures are not as clear as we would want them to be, but we know that there are the course way of operations, the way it happens in our brains. It is similar to how these convolutions are used in CNNs.
No, sir. Sir, in most of the industrial robots, still they are using sensors like lidars and radars for autonomous navigation. Only few of the industries and automotive technologies like Tesla are using a vision-based navigation. So I have some pretty much knowledge about building an autonomous robot using lidars and sensors. But if I need to start with visual SLAM and visual based autonomous navigation, where could I start with, and what are the techniques can I follow?
So like all the examples which I was looking at, which I showed earlier, where these different tasks, for example, scene understanding, navigation and interaction. So like computer vision and machine learning based techniques are there for both images and for LiDAR sensors as well. So like both areas of research are growing quite a lot. So whatever people do with 3D data, so the moment you take LiDAR data and then process it for any kind of, like let's say you're doing SLAM, or you're using it to learn representations or performing an end-to-end task. So you can do it in using both the ways. Like you can use images or you can use LiDAR sensors. It probably just depends on how, like one of the reasons why Tesla doesn't use it is LiDARs are expensive, and given the fact that humans do it so well just through vision, so why can't machines do it through vision? So that motivation is there. And then we know that computer vision has matured to the point that you can actually make a lot out of that information that you process and parse those images to detect objects, to do semantic segmentation or whatever task you want. So it's very much possible that you could use these existing methods and then redo your pipelines.
Thank you, sir. I think that completes the questions from the audience. So I would like to thank you for the insightful answers and the great talk that you presented today. So we would like to present you with a token of appreciation from the organizing team. So if you can just, Surya, I think if you can just share your screen.
Yeah, in a sec, Pratham, just a second.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry for the delay, but yes, so this is from our side, just a digital portrait, which is made by Disha Mewara. So thank you for
Great. This is
coming
lovely.
here,
Thank you.
your talk. We will definitely send this to you by mail. So thank you,
Awesome.
sir. And this concludes our first Robust Talk event of Takshak 2021. I would like to thank all the participants and sir once again for hosting this event.
Thanks
Thank
a lot
you.
for having me, and thanks for that poster, that portrait as well. Awesome. Cheers.
No problem, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you, sir.
Good audience.
Thank you.
Okay.